Please help me welcome Shirley and Ray.
So we're going to start this talk off with a 5-minute film clip that accompanies the book. And this film clip was created by my cousin, Vanessa Saito Yule, whose mother was born at Heart Mountain and was my mother's youngest and only sister. So go ahead and let the video roll. I always knew that my parents met as children at a place called Heart Mountain in Wyoming. And my mother, Setsuko, always called it a place of love. It was only after she died, however, that I learned the truth. Heart Mountain was a prison. 14,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated there during World War II for the crime of looking like the enemy. Setsuko's secret is my attempt to understand the lives of my family, myself, in the complicated history of the Japanese American experience. Both sets of my grandparents immigrated from Japan. The Higuchis came first, arriving in 1915 from Saga, on the southern island of Kyushu. They started farming in Santa Clara County, California. My mother's parents, the Saitos, came in 1918 and in 1923. They lived in San Francisco's Japantown and opened a store. Life in California was hard for Japanese Americans. State law banned immigrants from owning land, and Caucasian neighbors often resented their success. The children of immigrants called the Nisei had to work extra hard to prove they were loyal Americans. Despite hardships, many Japanese Americans found the good life and made their way in society. Some became professionals and owned their own home, and others excelled in college. But then came December 7th, 1941. After Pearl Harbor, wartime hysteria and racism intensified towards Japanese immigrants and Japanese American citizens. They called them spies or saboteurs, despite the lack of evidence. Then on February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which allowed the military to ban Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Census records told the government where to find Japanese Americans. Signs posted in neighborhoods said they had just days to pack and leave. They could only bring what they could carry. My family was issued a duffel bag with their name and number stenciled on the outside. Shikata ganai, some said, the Japanese term for "it can't be helped." There was little resistance. They were first sent to assembly centers, which were temporary concentration camps on converted fairgrounds and racetracks. Some families slept in horse stalls and were forced to live like animals. This lasted a few months. Then the prisoners rode on a darkened train to one of the 10 concentration camps scattered across the U.S. My father remembers peering under the window shades to see where the train was going. My family was sent to Heart Mountain Relocation Center in Wyoming. Many prisoners wept when they saw their new home surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Wind and dust swept through the tar paper walls. The barracks had no running water, the bathrooms had no privacy, and the mess hall food was terrible. Summers were sweltering and winters were brutal. The prisoners repeated another term, gaman, which means endure. In spite of this treatment, many incarcerees yearned to serve the country that imprisoned them. They enlisted in the army and fought bravely in Europe and the Pacific. But others stood up for their rights. More than 80 men at Heart Mountain resisted the military draft as long as they were prisoners. They were convicted and sent to federal prison. The rest of the Japanese American community shunned them for decades. My parents and grandparents spent 3 years behind barbed wire. After the war, they, along with many others in the community, wanted to put the shame and the rejection behind them. They never talked about it. My generation, called the Sansei, could not understand why. Only after my mother died did I realize the depth of her commitment to preserving the memory of the incarceration. She inspired me to understand this part of my family's history and my community's experience. Over the last decade, I've been committed to safeguarding against the racism and fear that drove the Japanese American incarceration. It was my mother, Setsuko, and her secret that taught me, and hopefully you, that we can never relax in the fight for justice. Well, that's the background film that accompanies the book. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with the incarceration, I thought a film like that is helpful for people that don't know much about it. But in audience-wise, how many know about the Japanese American incarceration experience? So folks are aware of it, and I think that background is helpful. So this is a PowerPoint that Ray and I used to talk about some of the background further beyond that film. And my day job is I'm Associate Chief for Professional Practice at the American Psychological Association. And I recently became tasked with developing best EDI practices for psychologists at the American Psychological Association. And then I'm also chair of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, which we just spoke about through that film. But just to give a little bit of background, what happened to the Japanese Americans after the incarceration experience, the community became very fractured. And one of the things that was important for Japanese Americans were to really assimilate and be the best Americans possible, given the fact they were incarcerated for being accused of not being loyal. So I always liked this photo that was taken in the 1960s where if you look at this family, it looks like the all-American family, except for the faces on here and the dress, it's kind of Leave It to Beaver. Jane Cleaver, my mom, my little brother there wearing the sailor outfit. But I think it really epitomized, what my parents were striving for when we first started out in Ann Arbor, Michigan in the 1960s. So this is, I think, really what shows the true assimilation by me is everyone knows cheerleading is such a all-American sport, an all-American thing, right? And here I am. I'm actually on top of Laura Gallagher, and her parents are sitting in the front row right now. Laura, a very dear friend in high school, and I recently reunited with her in Park City after all these years. But as you can see by this photo, everyone in the photo except for me is black and white. And that's what Huron High School and what Ann Arbor, Michigan was like when I was growing up. So I had to really kind of jockey through that experience, being the only Asian, the only Japanese American for sure. So what is a byproduct of a child's incarceration experience? I mean, it's a very traumatic thing that my parents went through, even though they never really talked about it. And what I see in this photo, my father on the right is somebody who was with a student, but my father was a workaholic. I mean, he literally worked 7 days a week. He always went to the university lab, the Department of Pharmacy, and he was there early in the morning, late at night. That's the only thing that I really remember about his life. But workaholism, if people that study psychology, is usually a byproduct of a traumatic experience, as well as being controlling and worrying about other things. But he was a workaholic, and that's where he was really driven.
And I think in some respects, I had a very unusual upbringing. You know, during the day when I went to high school and hanging out with my friends, I was, you know, with mostly, again, white and black students. But what was interesting about my dad's career at the University of Michigan is that he was well known as a scientist internationally. So he would frequently bring home professors from Japan, China, Egypt, Europe, et cetera. So I had this very stilted view of what it was like to be with other Asians beyond myself and my family. And I think in some ways made it somewhat distorted for me in some ways. I mean, it's not like I was growing up in LA, right, with a bunch of Japanese Americans. It was like my introduction to Asian people were as foreigners as well. So I always found that kind of interesting. And then my dad and my mother, you know, really assimilated in the university life. They had frequent dinners and events. And again, in some ways, living in Ann Arbor is like living in a bubble. And I think given the incarceration experience and sort of the accelerated track that my parents were on in terms of really being the best in our community, they never really talked about their incarceration experience. And people who knew them back then were really surprised that after my mother died, when I told them, did you know that my parents were incarcerated? And that's part of the story that's in my book. So what my life has been since I left Ann Arbor, Michigan, and attending University of Michigan is I went to Georgetown Law School. And I went on to work on a trajectory of working at Epstein, Becker & Green law firm. I went after that to the American Psychological Association. I served as DC bar president, and I pretty much stayed in Washington, DC, and never really left. So I sort of left Ann Arbor behind, left all the memories behind, and sort of created a whole different life, which was kind of interesting because Washington, DC legal community are mostly black and whites. There weren't a lot of Asians when I first arrived. So in some respects, that experience in Ann Arbor really worked really well for me. I was one of the few Japanese Americans that went to Georgetown Law School. I was the first Japanese American Asian to ever be an attorney for Epstein Becker. Same thing with APA, and I was the first DC bar president who was an Asian. So I was always the first Asian. And that's kind of like what my experience has been most of my life. So then when my mother got sick with pancreatic cancer in 2002, actually during my bar year, she passed away in 2005. She put up a really big fight, and that's all in the book. And what I did was I got this phone call out of the blue that wanted my dad and me and my brothers to come out to Wyoming for this ribbon cutting dedication they wanted to give for my mother. But part of Setsuko's secret is the fact that my mother really never talked about her incarceration experience. And we found out much later that she was donating money secretly to Heart Mountain, dreaming of something being built there. And I never knew anything about it until her deathbed experience. So this is a photograph of me going out there, the dedication to her, and the overwhelming feeling of realizing that Heart Mountain was bigger than my mother. Heart Mountain was bigger than me and my family. I mean, Heart Mountain was significant as an experience that this country has had, and that's sort of what captivated me at the time. So when we look back at my mother's side of the family, this is a pre-war photo of the Saitos, my mother's side. They were city people from San Francisco, and you can tell by the way they're dressed and the way my grandmother looks that they are much more sophisticated and refined than you'll see when we see photos on my father's side. Being city merchants kind of put them on a different level, I think, in the Japanese American community, a different level of sophistication, whereas many of the Japanese Americans, like my father's side, the Higuchis, were farmers, and so they had very different lifestyles back then. And I'll talk more about that. So this is Japantown, San Francisco, pre-war photo. And this is what my mother's family was experiencing at the time before the war had broken out. So when we look at my father's side of the family, these are the Higuchis. And my father right here is holding a toy gun. They lived on 14.25 acres, now known as Silicon Valley today. So you can imagine how much that property was worth. Unfortunately, they lost it during the war in a distress sale. And the idea of losing all that land and that family haunted them their entire lives. And I heard about it a lot when I was a kid. And what's really interesting is the two kids behind them are actually Mexican children. And what I found out through the research of my book is that my grandfather was very much of a pro bono kind of giver to the community, which I never really knew about. He allowed Mexican immigrant families to stay on the farm, not to work, but for free, because they had no other place to go. So I find it interesting, even the challenges that my grandparents had during the time. They had an open enough heart to want to help, other immigrants, such as the Mexican family that was living with them at the time. As a result, my father was fluent in Spanish before the war, fluent in Spanish. And then after he left the camps, he forgot how to speak Spanish, and he became fluent in Japanese, because it was the first time after leaving the 14.25 acres that he was around so many immigrant Japanese parents and other children that looked like him. So I always found that to be really interesting. So this is a photograph that was actually taken before the war. A lot of people have asked me, how could the United States round up, over 120,000 individuals, 2/3 of which were American citizens? And what I tell people is that the amount of racism that existed against Asians during that time period before World War II was really high. And this was taken around 1936, 1938. So this area was really ripe and primed for discrimination. In other words, it took economic reasons, politicians who weren't doing their jobs, a failed court system, but it was really a lot of economic growth by the Japanese Americans in farming that really got the Food Growers Association to really advocate for the forced removal of Japanese Americans during World War II. So, Ray, I'm going to let you pick up these slides if you want to start talking about the executive order and then the map that we'll show next.
Okay, so Executive Order 9066 was signed on February 19th, 1942 by President Roosevelt. There were multiple people in the administration who wanted something to be done because they believed that there were too many Japanese Americans on the West Coast living on land that was near railroads or defense installations. And despite the absolute lack of evidence that these people were a threat, he was pressured into signing this executive order that led to their removal. Interesting thing about this order, nowhere does it mention Japanese Americans. It mentions vague threats. It was up to the military to identify the people they considered threats, and the racist people who were in charge of the Western Defense Command, specifically a general named John DeWitt, singled out Japanese Americans, even though there were Italian and German nationals who lived in those same areas. Like in San Francisco, for example, multiple Italian immigrants. I mean, for example, Joe DiMaggio and his family from San Francisco, who were Italian immigrants, nothing happened to them. Only the Japanese Americans were singled out. Here's a map of where the 10 War Relocation Authority camps were. They're marked by the triangles there. They went from California, Minidoka and Tule Lake, all the way to Arkansas, where there were 2 camps, Rower and Jerome, down there on the Mississippi River. They were fed by a series of what were called assembly centers, which are mentioned in the video. Those were fairgrounds and racetracks where people were kept temporarily before they were dispersed to these various camps. This is Shirley's oldest uncle, James. At the time of Pearl Harbor, he was an Army officer, a doctor in the Army, was stationed at a place called Camp Roberts in California. Right after Pearl Harbor, he was transferred to Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, now Fort Chaffee, still there. He had to leave his military base one day and go to a notary public in nearby Fort Smith, Arkansas, to sign the sale documents for the family farm. And the reason he had to do that is because immigrants were not allowed to own land in California and many states, called the Alien Land Law. That was passed in 1913 in California. So James and his brother Kiyoshi had to go with their father to a lawyer in San Francisco and do the deed of sale to buy the land. And they're actually they're listed on the sale deed in 1942 when they sold it for about $150. We estimated that all of the property on that 14.25 acres in San Jose, the various buildings there, probably worth $65 million today. That's the infield at the Santa Anita racetrack, which still exists. They put up all these temporary barracks there where people had to live for a period of like 3 months. Shirley's dad's family was there. Her dad and her aunt went to school sitting in the bleachers at the racetrack. George Takei, the actor, was also at Santa Anita. Some of the people, the first group of people there actually did live in the horse stalls where legendary racehorse Seabiscuit used to race and stay. So they used to talk that they showered in the same paddocks where Seabiscuit also was showered. I think probably Seabiscuit had it easier than many of these people. And that's Heart Mountain. It was named by the Apsalake or Crow Native American nation who used to live around there before successive treaties forced them up into Montana. This one chief thought it looked like a buffalo's heart and the name stuck. Doesn't look like it from this view. This is looking at it from the east. It kind of looks like Devil's Tower, the also iconic mountain that you see in Wyoming. But from the south and the north, it has a different kind of shape. At the most, 14,000 Japanese Americans lived in Heart Mountain during some point in the war.
So I'll pick it up from here. You know, what happened after a while at the Heart Mountain camp is, I think, very soon many of the guards that worked there and the people that taught there, the white teachers, et cetera, they knew that they really were falsely imprisoning the Japanese Americans. I mean, they became very productive in camp. They weren't trying to escape. There was no evidence of espionage and sabotage or anything of that nature. But what is really interesting, if this was truly a prison camp, why is it that my father, who was only 11 years old at the time, was given a camera by his brother that he was allowed to use? So my dad, as a kid, went around taking these photos, and this was taken by my father. There's my grandfather sitting inside the barrack, the original photograph. I always wondered what he was thinking about when he was looking out the window and resting, and I always thought he was probably dreaming of the land that he lost, the 14.25 acres, and maybe when would he be able to leave the camp. The other photo is my grandfather with my aunt, who was only 5 years old at the time, and she's still alive now today. And she's turning 86 in December. She's doing really well. But a lot of times when we're looking at the intergenerational trauma and the impact this had on families during the time, I think you can even look at my aunt at age 5 and see how tense she is. She's holding on to her wrist. She seems to be frowning, and she seems very nervous, which when I look at this photo, I always have that feeling, you know, how hard it must have been for her as a 5-year-old to go through that. And this is an iconic photo that now stands in the museum. My father on the left with his work boots as a farmer, my mother, the city girl, looking all prim and proper. And they really didn't know each other in this 9th grade photo. This was shortly before they were released. But what's ironic is that they're sitting next to each other, and they bumped into each other accidentally at the University of California, Berkeley, many years later, and they recognized each other from their time at Heart Mountain, and they fell in love and got married, and the rest is history. So what I say to people is, we really can't pick and choose what we like out of life. I mean, if you think about it, if my parents were never incarcerated, I wouldn't be standing here today because they would have never met. There's no way that they would have ever connected. Where San Jose is located versus San Francisco, the chances of them knowing each other would have been pretty slim. And my dad might have ended up staying on that farm. 14.25 acres. He probably would have become a farmer, and he would have had a very different life. That's what I find very interesting is how just one thing could basically shift the entire trajectory of where your life goes. So when we talk about what is Setsuko's secret, basically her secret was that she never really talked about the camps. But the bigger secret is I never knew how much it really meant to her to memorialize that place. So that was the biggest secret for me. There are many secrets that I found out later, things that I didn't know about. But more importantly for her, what she wanted to do was keep those negative feelings buried and to really assimilate and excel and be part of the community. And that's what she did. This is a photo of her at Berkeley when she was graduating. That's her younger sister who was born at Heart Mountain. Actually, Kathy, who is on my board, she's now 78. Oh my gosh, she's 79. She looks great, by the way. She's sitting on the board right now, and she's helping me keep Heart Mountain going and building the foundation. So it's become a bit of a family affair. And this is a wider photo of the iconic photo that's in the museum. It's just, for my parents, I think being around this many Japanese American kids and all at once probably was really overwhelming. They never met so many Japanese in their whole life being in prison like this. And I find it interesting, you see the teacher, the only white person in this photo, and this is pretty much what daily life for these kids were like in the camp. So one of the things that we've been researching, and a lot of this has to do with my work at the American Psychological Association, is what is the transgenerational, what is the trauma that families experience that are passed down? And I talked about my father being a workaholic. My mother was a perfectionist. She also was very controlling in her own way. She was also very nice, but you could be controlling and nice at the same time. But when I worked with Dr. Satsuki Ino, who's in this photograph, who was also incarcerated as a child, she noted that in her research that there was some adults that experienced anxiety, depression, startled responses, extreme vigilance, and a need for control in uncertain situations. And I experienced that with my mother. There was a big need for her to always maintain control of everything, the household, the family, etc. So one of the things my mother couldn't live to see was after she passed in 2005 is we did have the grand opening, and this is the ribbon cutting of our museum out in Wyoming. Secretary Norman Mineta next to me was Secretary of Commerce under Clinton and Secretary of Transportation under George W. Bush, which is the first to be able to serve at that level in two administrations. He recently passed away. He was incarcerated as a child with my parents, too. Takashi Hoshizaki in the middle was a resistor that you saw in the film. The young men who turned 18 in camp and said, "We will not fight until you restore my rights." And he wrote that as an 18-year-old in his war relocation file. And he's now known as a civil rights hero and really advanced beyond his time when he was incarcerated, that he was strong enough to say, "I'm not going to fight unless you restore my rights as an American citizen." And then the tall man in the back, that's Senator Alan K. Simpson from Wyoming. And next to him is Senator Inoue, who's deceased right now, but he was one of the highest ranking senators in Washington, D.C. And he also was a war hero, where he was given the Medal of Honor and lost his arm in battle. Do you want to comment on that battle scene of Senator Inoue?
It was near the end of the war in Italy. He charged up a hill. He got shot multiple times. He took a a grenade shot in his right shoulder. Basically, his arm was hanging by a thread. Was still clutching a grenade in his hand, which he took his other hand and threw it out, and then tumbled down a hillside after he killed a bunch of German soldiers. He should have received the Medal of Honor shortly afterward, but racism prevented all the Japanese American war heroes, except for one, from receiving the Medal of Honor in a contemporaneous way. He received it in 2000 from Bill Clinton in a ceremony at the White House after Congress passed a law to review all these medals, the Distinguished Service Crosses that had been received by Japanese Americans. And his was upgraded with 16 other Japanese American soldiers, including two who had ties to Heart Mountain, James Okubo and Joe Hayashi.
So one of the things that we have done pretty well at Heart Mountain is we're an independently owned, operated museum and foundation. And part of the reason why we're not a Smithsonian or government-run National Park Service type museum is we want the ability to speak out independently and not have a sanitized view of how we relate to the world. So we worked on a lot of different op-eds trying to tie in the experiences of the Japanese Americans during World War II and make it generalizable to what's happening today. So I've written op-eds in terms of the border separation and the long-term mental health problems that result from incarcerating families at the border. We talk about the misuse of census data and how census data could be misused to hurt other groups of people. And we talked about how immigrants have long fought bravely for the United States, and to treat our immigrants with lack of respect is essentially not right when many of them have gone to war to fight on behalf of this country. The other thing that we did, too, was that, the Japanese American community after the war was really fractured. There's been a lot of infighting. The individuals that volunteered to fight in the war had problems with the ones that resisted. And the fracturing of the community made it very difficult for Japanese American groups to work together. So one of the things we accomplished was the Japanese American Confinement Sites Consortium. Nancy Pelosi hosted us on Capitol Hill, along with Secretary Norman Mineta. He unfortunately recently just passed away a couple of months ago. But this is one of the pinnacle events that we experienced, being welcomed by Pelosi in her grand office on Capitol Hill. And the other things that we try to do is really encourage all professionals out there to visit our museum. And what we were able to do in 2014 is that the National Consortium of Ethnic and Racial Fairness in the Courts, judges from all across the country in 2014 came to our museum and our site. And, African American judges, white judges, Hispanic judges, Asian judges, and actually the Asian judge on this side of the photo is Judge Lancito, who was a judge in the O.J. Simpson trial. His parents were incarcerated at Heart Mountain along with my parents. So there are a lot of well-known Japanese Americans out there that have actually been incarcerated, or their families were incarcerated, and people just don't talk about it, so no one really knows about it. And one of the things writing Setsuko's Secret for me was it really served to help process my family history. It processed things that allowed me to understand my parents and grandparents better. And most importantly, it helped me figure out more about who I was. And I always kind of joke that writing this book was like being in psychotherapy. And working for the American Psychological Association, it's something that I recognized pretty quickly. This is the last chapter in the book, the epilogue. I've been doing a lot of work with the Japanese government and the embassy. It just sort of fell on my lap. The book that you all have access to is going to actually be translated into Japanese, and will be released in Japan in December. So I have to figure out how I'm going to get over there and have book talks with the translator, because I don't speak Japanese. But what they did was they had a superb interpreter for me. And I met my grandmother's niece, who was 89 in this photo. And it was the first time that I had a relative tell me about how horrible the experience was for my grandmother and for my family members that were incarcerated. Because my mother never, talked about it. My dad didn't talk about it. It was always glossed over as a fun place to be. It wasn't that bad. It's where I met Dad. But when I met Sumiko, who, by the way, just recently passed as well, she broke down in tears and told me that she stayed up night after night with my grandmother, who was there after the war in the 1960s, and then how much they just cried together. And I think what that was is my grandmother didn't want to burden her grandchildren, her children, with all her sorrow about what happened, but she felt comfortable talking to her niece about that. And when you read the epilogue to the book, I go into detail how, why did I have to go to Japan with an interpreter to find out how my family reacted to their experiences. So that was a very fortuitous event that I was able to have that trip created by the Japanese embassy. And one of the biggest things that we're doing now is we are building the Minetta Simpson Institute at Heart Mountain. We will literally have like a state-of-the-art conference center, a place to do broadcasts, have more research, think tanks, et cetera. And the Minetta Simpson Institute is named after Norm Minetta and Al Simpson, who've been able to work across the aisle, one a Republican, the other a Democrat. They work across the aisle for common good. So basically, the Institute will seek to inspire bipartisan solutions to vexing and complicated problems and emphasize the need to find principled common ground, which is what I think our country needs today. Is we need to work together to make this country strong, and we need to be empathetic and understanding and supportive of others. And we hope that we'll be able to do that through the Minetta Simpson Institute. Norman Y. Minetta, who was a mentor and a hero to me, and I talked about him previously, one of the things he said to us after the museum was built, that this was a labor of love for all of us. It's not about the past, it's about the future, because history always has the ability to repeat itself. What we're doing here is drawing a line in the sand and saying never again. And so that's why this is an important part of our history. This is why we have to tell this story. This is why I'm grateful if the Ann Arbor Public School System and the libraries carry this book, because the only way that we're going to educate people about this is to talk about it and read about it and have it part of our American history. And that's the end of our presentation, and we'll open it up for questions. We have a website for Heart Mountain, and we have a website for our JAX Consortium. And I look forward to hearing all your questions.